In this final chapter of the Wars of Scottish Independence, we take a look at the last and longest campaign of them all, rounding out half a century of fighting across the borderlands, when, due to another succession crisis, claimants to the Scottish throne sought assistance from the ever-wily English to help take the place they considered rightfully theirs. These actions broke the temporary truce between England and Scotland, and led to many pivotal battles that would ultimately decide the fate of the two nations. While the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in March 1328 had brought about peace at the end of the First War of Scottish Independence, this end to hostilities was not one universally accepted on both sides of the border. The English deeply resented the terms of the agreement, believing it to be a shameful surrender of the ideals of Scottish conquest as originally pursued by King Edward I, while Edward's grandson, the current King Edward III, held particular disfavour with the treaty, being only 15 years old at the time of its ratification, and was essentially forced into signing the pact by those around him, rather than wanting to accept peace between the two nations on his own terms. In Scotland, the outcomes of the treaty disinherited many Scottish nobles who had refused to swear fealty to King Robert I, thus driving them into the hands of Edward Balliol, the eldest son of the exiled King John I. King John had been deposed and imprisoned during the original invasion of Scotland in 1296, with many of the ruling class in Scotland believing the line of Balliol to be the rightful monarchs of Scotland, despite the fact that John Balliol's original rise to the throne was itself mired in a controversial succession crisis. Unfortunately, yet another crisis brewed only a year later in 1329, when King Robert I died at the age of 54, his son, the then 5-year-old David, being too young to rule by his own hand, with political actions being undertaken on his behalf by an appointed Guardian of Scotland, which would come to pass initially as Thomas Randolph, 1st Earl of Moray. Thomas Randolph was noted for his just and wise rule during the Regency, though the change in monarch once again ignited the issue of succession, supporters of Edward Balliol continuing to stir opposition by proclaiming that Robert Bruce and his offspring had usurped the Scottish throne, and that it rightfully belonged to the House of Balliol. In response, Balliol himself, together with Henry Beaumont, Earl of Buchan, gathered with the disinherited Scottish lords in Yorkshire during 1331 to plan an invasion of Scotland. This proposal, officially, did not gain the approval of King Edward III, while unofficially, the English monarch endorsed their upcoming campaign, seeking any method possible to destabilise his northern neighbour. Edward thus decreed that any invasion of Scotland over land across the English border would be blocked, although he did not oppose their invasion by sea, with Balliol's force sailing from Yorkshire harbours on July 31, 1332, bound for Scotland. In Scotland, the potential invasion of Balliol and his nobles had not gone unnoticed, with Thomas Randolph having prepared a repelling force along the English border and Scottish coast to defend the kingdom, though 10 days before Balliol's army sailed, Randolph died suddenly from what was believed to be poisoning, with theorists suggesting that Edward III had arranged his murder, thus robbing the Scots of a wise regent and a soldier with great experience during the previous wars and the invasion of Ireland. Balliol's force of 2,000 men, made up predominantly of English soldiers, landed in Fife on August 6th, there followed by a fierce battle against the Scottish defenders that eventually led to him establishing a beachhead at Kinghorn. 5 days later, the rebel army marched on Perth, where they faced off against the 15,000 to 40,000 strong Scottish army under the leadership of the new Guardian of Scotland, Domhnall II, Earl of Mar. This led to the clumsy and disorganised Battle of Duplin Moor, where in their bid to trounce the rebels, the Scots army became trapped in a tight valley when they failed to break the English line, reinforcements coming from behind, giving those at the front no room to manoeuvre, and thus made them easy prey to the notorious English longbowmen. The resultant crush saw more Scottish soldiers killed through trampling and suffocation rather than from rebel action, with thousands of Scots dying, including a number of nobles such as Domhnall himself and Robert Bruce's illegitimate son, also named Robert, while Balliol's side only reported 35 casualties. Following this action, Perth was captured, with Balliol being crowned King of Scotland on September 24, 1332, at Scone, the traditional place of coronation for Scottish monarchs, the new king immediately granting Edward III Scottish estates to the value of £2,000, which included the town, castle and county of Berwick. As expected, Balliol's seizure of the Scottish throne was met with continued opposition from the side of David Bruce, with October 7th seeing David's partisans recapturing Perth and destroying its walls, while on December 16th, Balliol's reign was cut short when his entourage was ambushed by supporters of David at the Battle of Annan. This forced the new king to flee the field half-dressed and ride for England, his ignoble retreat being followed by an appeal to Edward III for assistance, thus allowing the English monarch to drop all pretense of neutrality and make ready for war. Confirming Balliol to be the rightful King of Scotland, and publicly acting in the interests of restoring a deposed monarch back on his throne, Edward's army began its invasion in March 1333. This invasion came in two main formations, one army approaching from the west at Carlisle under Balliol, while Edward himself led the main army north out of Newcastle a month later in April, converging on the Scottish fortress town of Berwick and placing it under siege. The town was subject to a near-continuous catapult bombardment for 2 months, and by June 1333, nearly the entire town was destroyed, suffering heavy casualties. On June 28th, the warden of Berwick, Sir Alexander Seton, negotiated with Edward's terms of surrender of the town, if not relieved by a Scottish army by July 11th. As part of this agreement, several townsfolk were handed over as hostages, including Seton's own son, leading Archibald Douglas, the new Guardian of Scotland, to march his army south to relieve the besieged garrison. Douglas, following the maxim of King Robert that Scots should avoid giving open battle to English armies, attempting to lure Edward's force away from Berwick through various diversions. One of these was to burn the town of Tweedmouth, while another was a daring raid against Bamborough Castle, where Queen Philippa, Edward's wife, had been left for safekeeping, though in the end, the attempted assault was not successful due to a lack of dedicated siege weapons, and thus the keep was held without much difficulty. All of these actions were ultimately in vain, as once July 11th had passed, the English declared the Scots garrison to be in breach of the surrender agreement by continuing their resistance, with Edward ordering that the hostages be hanged at a rate of 2 per day, starting with Seton's son. Therefore, the terms of the surrender were hardened so that the fate of Berwick would be based either on the Scots winning the battle against the English or by inserting a force of 200 men into the town by July 20th, otherwise Berwick would yield to Edward. Thus, on July 19th, Douglas recrossed the Tweed and approached Berwick from the northwest, seeking to do battle with Edward at Halidon Hill, 2 miles northwest of the town, the English adopting the same formation they had used at the triumphant Battle of Duplin Moor and earlier at Falkirk, with bodies of dismounted men-at-arms interspersed with groups of archers. The Scots, meanwhile, took up 4 divisions under the command of various nobles, a long pause preceding the battle as both sides waited to see who would strike first. Eventually, the Scottish army moved from their position on the high ground, across the intervening boggy valley, and up the side of Halidon Hill towards the English positions. And though the Scots army was significantly larger than Edward III's invasion force, and was confident of victory, this confidence was dispelled quickly at the points of English arrows. The longbowmen made easy work of the advancing Scots, and caused massive casualties, those Scots that had survived the initial onslaught and were actually able to make it to the English line, being exhausted and bloodied, falling prey to Edward's knights, who cut down their enemies with impunity. In confusion and chaos, the Scottish army retreated, pursued by the English knights on horseback, who continued the massacre for mile after mile across the surrounding countryside, the Earl of Ross, who attempted to relieve Berwick by marching around Edward's army, being repelled and put to flight, Scottish casualties in the battle being very heavy, with the Guardian, Douglas, being mortally wounded and captured, alongside the Earls of Sutherland and Menteith. Among the dead were the Earl of Ross, Malcolm, Earl of Lennox, Alexander Bruce, the Earl of Carrick, John Campbell, the Earl of Athol, John Graham, Alexander Lindsay, John and Simon Fraser, and John, James and Alan Stewart, the destruction of the Scots army being so overwhelming that no reliable source could count how many thousands had actually died within their faction. The English, on the other hand, are known to only have suffered, at most, around 100 casualties, the few survivors captured by Edward being beheaded the following day, just as Berwick laid down its arms to the English king in accordance with the terms of surrender. With the Scots army destroyed, and the Guardian dead, nothing could prevent Edward Balliol from retaking his place on the throne, David, the son of Robert Bruce, fleeing Scotland in May 1334, and taking refuge in France at the invitation of King Philip VI. Balliol subsequently paid homage to Edward for Scotland, and formally ceded 8 counties of southeast Scotland to England, ruling a largely truncated Scottish state from Perth, while attempting to put down continued resistance by those still loyal to David. The invasion, therefore, appeared to be fully secured, as by the end of 1334, David's partisans only held 5 fortifications within all of Scotland, and seemed ripe for destruction by the new king's forces, though total victory could not yet be claimed, as within Balliol's factions, infighting over political principles and captured lands meant his reign was never seated on solid foundations, only serving to encourage the continued resistance of David's partisans. Furthermore, the partisans were secretly being financed by the French due to their disfavour with the expansion of England into Scotland. Balliol, amid the internal feuds and the continued rebellion staged by David's loyalists, retreating back to Berwick, where he persuaded Edward to spend the winter of 1334 to 1335 in nearby Roxburgh. Both monarchs led a vicious campaign across the western lowlands, destroying the property of friend and foe alike, but found no Scottish troops, while in response to this wanton destruction, more of Balliol's former supporters defected to the side of David Bruce, who formally appealed to Philip VI for military assistance. Predating the Wars of Independence, France had already signed an alliance of mutual defence with Scotland in 1295, as renewed in 1326, known as the Old Alliance, this being hoped to deter any attempt by the ambitious English monarchs, King Edward I and later King Edward III, from attacking either country. However, by 1331, Philip VI, as he prepared to undertake a crusade of the Holy Land, needed the support of the English in order to carry out this campaign, and thus, after 6 years of negotiating with Edward regarding the acquiescence of his realm, leading to the French ambassador being sent to meet Edward in Newcastle during 1335 in order to ascertain the basis of the English king's aggression towards Scotland. Edward, therefore, allowed the ambassador the opportunity to negotiate peace between the two nations, a truce eventually being agreed, though unfortunately for the Scots, by the middle of 1335, widespread infighting between the Scottish nobles failed to settle on a single position regarding the negotiations, allowing Edward time to rebuild his finances and reassemble another army. Gathering more than 13,000 men on the Scottish border, the largest army ever led against the Scots, Edward III awaited the expiration of the truce before launching his attack, while Bruce loyalists, in response to the build-up of English forces south of the border, prepared their defence, setting aside their personal differences and evacuating the central lowlands ahead of the invasion. The assault came in July 1335, with 2 waves, Edward leading half the army north from Carlisle, and Balliol leading the other half north from Berwick, both factions intending to meet at Glasgow, with the Scots adopting a scorched earth policy and offering no sustained resistance, while what little that hadn't been destroyed by the Scots was devastated by the English, looting everything in their path so as to draw out their adversaries. The final goal of Edward was to capture the then Scottish capital of Perth, the French, under the Old Alliance, responding to Edward's campaign through the assembly of 6,000 men that was sent to Scotland to fight the English directly, while English possessions in France were threatened with confiscation. The combined Scottish and French vessels in the English Channel subsequently attacked English shipping and raided southern English towns, with Philip declaring that Edward should allow for Pope Benedict XII to arbitrate as to the matter of Scottish succession so as to avoid an Anglo-French war, Edward refusing this proposal, but did allow a 6-month truce between October 1335 and May 1336. This truce, however, did not include Balliol's forces, who were still subject to assault by David's loyalists throughout the winter, Sir Andrew Murray leading an army of 1,100 men against the pro-Balliol force of David Strathbogie at the Battle of Colbleen, leading to the latter's defeat. Meanwhile, the Pope attempted to persuade Philip to postpone any further action against the English, as he hoped to salvage the possibility of undertaking a crusade in the Holy Land, although in the end, Philip opted to focus instead on restoring David to the Scottish throne, more than 500 ships being assembled in Normandy so as to land an army in Scotland and an invasion force at Portsmouth in England. Edward III, meanwhile, spent the spring of 1336 raising funds for the Scottish War and making arrangements to guard the English south coast, the Scots preferring not to engage the English, as they knew through bitter experience that attempting to fight in pitched battle against an English army was doomed to failure unless under very favourable circumstances, the Scots instead maintaining their scorched earth policy, which also included the burning of Perth just prior to the arrival of the English forces. Edward III, upon hearing of a possible French army being landed in Scotland, rode north to lead his forces against an invasion force that ultimately failed to arrive, the loss of the French support leading Edward to march north with 800 men out of Perth in July 1336 in order to devastate the Scottish east coast between the Firth of Tay and the Moray Firth, destroying Fours and Aberdeen, with the latter's destruction ensuring that the French were not provided a suitable port in which to disembark their army. With all attempts to negotiate with either David or Philip VI having failed, the French king continued to declare his full military support to David's partisans, leading to a campaign of harassment against English interests in order to keep Edward divided between Scotland and the south coast of England, French privateers attacking English vessels in the Channel, while Murray's rebel faction undertook a highly effective guerrilla campaign against the English army in the north. In addition, the outcome of the scorched earth policy used by the Scots quickly became evident, as with so much fertile farmland burned so as to deny its use by the English, famine and disease were rampant throughout Scotland, disproportionately affecting the native population, as English soldiers were supplied by shipments from the south. With political and legal pressure from the French increasing, Philip VI prepared his army to invade Edward's holdings in Gascony during 1337, leading the English monarch to return from Scotland in the winter of 1336 and ready a second army that would fight in a bitter war in France. All attempts by the papal authorities in Rome to stop this upcoming conflict and allow for a crusade of the Holy Land being ignored in the face of more pressing domestic priorities. With Edward distracted by the start of hostilities in France, which would ultimately lead to the 116-year-long Hundred Years' War during May 1337, David's partisans swept across the occupied regions of Scotland and drove out the under-resourced English, April 1337 seeing a Scottish army invade Galloway, which was held under the rule of Balliol, leading to widespread devastation and its eventual recapture by the Scots. David's forces then raided the Lowlands, besieging Edinburgh Castle in November, and even attacked Carlisle in England, Edward, at the time, considering the potential invasion of southern England by the French to be a much more pressing concern, sending a token army north to defend against the Scots, but this proved to be generally ineffective against the highly mobile and extremely organised partisans. Eventually, the English monarch was forced to send a much larger expeditionary force north in 1338, despite his commitments to the war in France, the French continuing to supply the Scots by sea, and therefore maintained a strong defence against the English over the course of several campaigns that were hampered by the continued scorched earth policy of David's loyalists, with Perth eventually being recaptured by a joint army of French and Scots in 1339. By 1340, the most northerly English holding in Scotland was Stirling Castle, while the open countryside between individual fortifications was well and truly in the hands of David's forces, each of the English castles being either besieged or blockaded, with their only supplies being provided through shipments by sea from England. Various truces being drafted that briefly curtailed the fighting, but these were often not observed, while attempts to unify the Scots nobles ended, as before, in petty internal squabbling that only served to give resolve to the English. King David II, now a teenager, returned to Scotland from his exile on June 2, 1341, and began to establish himself as the main authority in the country, which only led to further disagreements as the nobles sought to maintain their power over a confused and politically unstable nation. Despite this, the Scots army was still able to mount a successful campaign against the common enemy of the English, with Stirling eventually being captured in March 1342 as the last English stronghold in Scotland north of the immediate border area. Even in victory, though, the Scots continued to row, as exemplified following the capture of Roxburgh Castle during the same month as the fall of Stirling, when David awarded Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie, who had taken the keep, the titles of Constable of Roxburgh and the Sheriff of Teviotdale, this move enraging his rival, William Douglas, Lord of Liddesdale, who had attempted to conquer the castle on multiple occasions, leading him to arrest Ramsay and starve him to death. However, by 1345, David had established general control over the Scots nobility, while raiding parties continued to harass the northern towns of England. July 1346 seeing Edward III land an army of 15,000 men in Normandy, and thus forcing Philip VI to call upon the Old Alliance, requesting that David launch an invasion of England, Philip considering that the northern border would be defenceless, as the vast majority of Edward's military power was now in Gascony, Brittany and Flanders. However, early attempts to reconnoitre into England by Scots forces were repulsed by local garrisons, thus meaning David was forced to muster a full Scottish army in order to undertake a sustained invasion of the south, the Scots campaign commencing on October 7, 1346, with an army of 12,000 men, carrying modern weapons and armour supplied by the French, together with a small number of French knights provided by Philip, David's army being the strongest and best equipped Scottish expedition for many years. However, despite Philip's appraisal of the potential lack of defences in northern England, Edward had predicted such a campaign would occur, and thereby exempted the counties of England north of the River Humber from partaking in his main invasion of Normandy, meaning that an English army of 7,000 men was quickly mobilised under the command of William de la Zouch, the Archbishop of York, taking the Scots by surprise when they encountered his forces outside the city of Durham. On October 17th, the two armies engaged in the Battle of Neville's Cross, initially leading to a stalemate as English longbowmen kept the Scots' advance at bay, eventually provoking the Scots to launch their charge during the afternoon, 3 divisions coming forward to attack the English in hand-to-hand combat, though due to the broken terrain and the fire of English archers, this assault was sent into retreat with heavy casualties. With the main thrust now in full withdrawal, the Earl of March and Robert Stewart abandoned the field with their men, and thus left David's meagre force to face off against the English longbows until a charge broke the remaining Scottish army, King David being wounded during the fighting and captured shortly after the end of the battle, while the rest of the Scottish army was pursued and destroyed by the English long into the night, more than 50 Scottish barons being killed or captured, thus constituting almost all of Scotland's military leadership. With David now in English hands, Balliol immediately set about consolidating his power by rallying the southern counties of Scotland to his side, while the English, with Scotland's army having been thoroughly routed, pressed home their advantage and launched an assault on the borderlands of England and Scotland, the capture of their monarch leading the Scots to appoint Robert Stewart Lord Guardian and Regent for David, Stewart being David's nephew through his mother, and as such was heir apparent to the Scottish throne. It was therefore expected he would use his energies to defend Scotland from the English and Balliol, but instead he generally focused his efforts on securing his own power rather than being a regent in David's absence, thereby ultimately leading to him being unable to muster the whole-scale support of the Scottish nobility due to his abandoning of the field at Neville's Cross, while David, deeply distrusting of Stewart, attempted to maintain control of Scottish affairs despite being in English captivity. With the Scottish king now in his power, Edward III had a strong bargaining counter, starting lengthy negotiations as to the future of the nation in exchange for the return of their monarch, initially proposing in 1348 that David hold Scotland as a fief from England, with either Edward or one of his sons being named successor to the Scots throne should David die childless. This was followed in 1350 by Edward offering a ransom to the Scottish nobles of £40,000, together with the restoration of Balliol's Scottish supporters, and the naming of Edward's young son, John of Gaunt, as David's successor should the king die without children. With the retraction of his earlier suggestion that Scotland become a fiefdom of England, David was returned briefly to Scotland in 1352 to try and negotiate a settlement, although Stewart strongly opposed any policies that would remove him from the line of succession, the offer subsequently being declined and David being returned to English imprisonment during March 1352. In 1354, Edward made yet another proposal to the Scots, in which he offered a simple demand of ransom without settlement of the English claim to suzerainty over Scotland, this proposal too being rejected, partly because it would leave open the possibility of further English attempts to bring Scotland under their control. In 1355, as tensions on the Anglo-Scottish border once again led to a military build-up by both sides, a truce was brokered between the English and the Scots in order to allow Edward to continue his campaign in France, though within days of the truce being signed, the Scots reneged on this agreement and invaded Northumberland, capturing Berwick in December and prompting Edward to redeploy an English army from the French War in order to retake the town and relieve the besieged castle. Unseating the Scots from Berwick in January 1356, the English soon marched on Roxburgh, Balliol surrendering his nominal position as King of Scotland on January 20th in favour of his overlord King Edward III, in exchange for a generous pension, while Edward's army advanced on Edinburgh, leaving a trail of devastation 50 miles wide in their wake and burning the city upon their arrival. Soon the English were preparing to launch their final assault on Perth, with the possible intention being that Edward would proclaim himself King of Scotland at the nearby Scone Abbey, though as the English relied heavily on consistent shipments of supply by sea from the south, sustained unfavourable weather meant this fleet was prevented from reaching Scotland, eventually leading to the withdrawal of the English army in the winter of 1356. In September of that year, the French army was thoroughly routed by the English at the Battle of Poitiers, with 6,000 from an army of 16,000 men being either killed or captured, including the King of France, this heavy defeat putting an end to their support of the Scottish cause, with a general truce being imposed on the French while their king was held a hostage in London. This therefore resulted in more English troops being freed up to allow for further campaigns in Scotland, and with the Scots having lost their financial and military aid, they negotiated a ransom of £67,000 for the return of King David, with the subsequent Treaty of Berwick, as signed on October 3, 1357, requiring that this ransom be paid annually over 10 years on the date of June 24th, or St. John the Baptist's Day. To guarantee these payments, 23 Scottish nobles were to be held as hostages by the English, while the treaty also prohibited any Scottish citizen from bearing arms against Edward III or any of his men until the sum was paid in full, although this was countered by the English ceasing all campaigns north of the border. The Treaty of Berwick, though legally only a truce rather than a formal peace treaty, essentially brought an end to the Second War of Scottish Independence, leaving both nations generally in the same position they had been at the start of hostilities back in 1296, England conquering little additional land in Scotland while the Scots maintained their independence. In the end, David returned to Scotland and immediately set about attempting to unify his feuding nobles, his reign being one blighted by doubt and distrust, with many of his subjects considering that he had lived a life of luxury and expensive tastes while in English captivity, as well as taking on an English mistress, thereby giving the impression that he was simply a puppet ruler under the authority of Edward III. Eventually, King David II was able to secure his throne in 1360, following a failed rebellion against him, and through negotiation was able to reduce the ransom debt owed to the English, the decades that followed seeing England and Scotland continue to fight across the borderlands, with both Scottish and English armies crossing into each other's territory throughout the next 4 decades, in what would ultimately lead to stalemates, punctuations of open conflict and hostility against the background of an uneasy peace.